Hello, good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7, or just a little past. Apologies tonight, we don't normally do traffic reports, but due to the fact that there are roadworks on my way in tonight, we are just a little tardy. My name is Donald C. Stewart. We're here in Cowcaddens at our studios, and I am delighted to be joined by Professor John Robertson from the UWS. John, delighted to see you and thank you for joining us.
It's very kind, thank you. Look, I've been retired some time, not at UWS anymore, I'm pleased to say.
We won't go into that, no doubt. I also have left academia in Ayrshire. So we begin this evening, as we always do, with our Ukrainian update and day 426 of the illegal Russian attack on the sovereign state of Ukraine. And the Ukrainian forces, based on the western side of the Dnieper River, are frequently carrying out raids on the eastern bank near the city of Kherson to try to dislodge Russian troops. Yuri Sobolevsky, deputy head of the Kherson Regional Administration, said today. He said the raids were intended to reduce the combat capability of Russian troops who have been shelling Kherson city since being forced to retreat. One person has been killed and 10 wounded in a strike on a museum in Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced. Ole Syniehobov, Governor of Kharkiv, said that rescue operations are ongoing at the site of the rocket attack in the centre of Kupiansk. The number of daily casualties Russia is suffering has fallen by about 30% in April, UK intelligence has reported in its daily intelligence briefing. Russia has switched to defensive positions in all of its areas of combat apart from Bakhmut, according to the Ukrainian head of intelligence, Kyrylo Budanov. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has proposed to Russian President Vladimir Putin a way forward aimed at the improvement, extension and expansion of a deal allowing the safe Black Sea export of Ukrainian grain, which Moscow has threatened to terminate from the 18th of May. Russia's foreign ministry has said it is expelling a Moldovan diplomat in what it cast as retaliation for the expulsion last week of a Russian diplomat from Moldova. Sweden is expelling 5 Russian diplomats, its foreign minister told public broadcaster SVT on Tuesday. Lithuania's parliament today voted in favour of allowing border guards to turn back migrants who illegally entered the country. Lithuania borders fellow EU states Latvia and Poland, as well as Belarus and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. Ukraine has rescued 138 civilians, including its own nationals and citizens of Georgia and Peru, who were trapped by fighting in Sudan, according to the Ukraine's military intelligence. A court in Russia has convicted a former police officer of publicly spreading false information about the country's military after he criticised the war in Ukraine to his friends over the phone. The world may have reached the dangerous, possibly even more dangerous threshold than it did during the Cold War, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has told the UN Security Council. Daria Trepova, woman charged with killing a pro-war Russian military blogger Vladimir Tatarsky using explosives, was denied bail by a Russian court on Monday. Ukrainian authorities said on Monday that Russian forces are forcibly evacuating civilians in the parts of the Kherson region that they still occupy, a day after it was claimed Ukrainian forces had established a bridgehead on the east bank of the Dnieper River. Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas voiced hope that the European membership talks with Kyiv could begin this year during a Monday visit to the Ukrainian city of Zhytomyr. John, every day, in every way, this seems to be expanding out, but one of the things that has become, I think, noticeable is the way that dissent within Russia seems to be responded to by arrest and detention and even imprisonment.
Yes, I mean that's the only sign we have of dissent there is when we see people being arrested. It seems quite a hopeless situation really for dissidents in Russia. It's a terrible situation, and I find that I'm an optimist by nature about many things, but I find it very hard to be optimistic about what's happening in Ukraine. It looks like it could run for years at the moment in this kind of bogged down stalemate and quite heavy loss of life on both sides. I think something may happen. We may be in for a surprise at some point, but at the moment it looks really very negative.
Does indeed, and part of that, of course, is to do with the stuff that we just heard there was to do with migration and moving about. And today, the Scottish Parliament has debated the UK illegal migration bill. Scottish Greens described the UK as a rogue state over the UK government's racist illegal migration bill. Speaking in a debate in the Scottish Parliament today, Scottish Greens Justice spokesperson Maggie Chapman MSP said in human rights terms, in terms of its solemn obligations under international law, in terms of the deep moral imperative to compassion and justice which prompted the Refugee Convention, the United Kingdom is now, let us be blunt, a rogue state. We've become accustomed over the past months to using the word unprecedented, but this is breathtaking in its utter annihilation of so much good. She added the right to seek refugee protection, the right to liberty and security, the right to access justice, to freedom from torture and freedom from slavery, all are fundamentally violated by this shameful piece of propaganda posing as legislation. The UK government's illegal migration bill returns to the House of Commons tomorrow, where it is expected to complete its remaining stages. In a statement, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the EHRC, said the illegal migration bill would remove protections from victims of trafficking and restrict rights to asylum. It would also allow for the detention of pregnant women and children and fail to consider the impact on torture, survivors and disabled people, according to the EHRC. The government has laid down 9 new clauses and 136 amendments to the bill to be discussed by MPs on Tuesday, a move that has been called undemocratic before the last day of scrutiny in the Commons. According to the EHRC, provisions providing for the detention of children and pregnant women and removing protections for victims of trafficking and modern slavery are particularly worrying. In a further blow, a Council of Europe Migration Committee has accused Rishi Sunak's government of a willful distortion of core United Nations and European conventions, which the UK itself contributed to designing. Its provisions would jeopardise the right to an effective remedy, breach the non-refoulement principle, endanger victims of forced labour and modern slavery, and strip international protection seekers of their right to seek asylum with no regard for the best interests of the child, according to the Council, which includes representatives from no fewer than 46 member countries. John, this type of dog whistling and the migration and the way in which this has been all put together just seems to be an increasing amount of embarrassing legislation for those who don't believe in it, but worrying legislation for those who are affected by it.
Yes. This bill will pass. It will pass because of the large Conservative majority. The Scottish Parliament will reject it, but perhaps almost unanimously. There can't be many, even in the Scottish Conservatives, who will actually be in favour of this bill. It's something we often don't remember is that Scottish Conservatives are actually not quite as bad as some of the ones down in Westminster. The bill will pass. It will be opposed up here, and it's an astonishing piece of evidence of how far the UK has travelled in this last 10, 12 years of Conservative government. I can't imagine that David Cameron really anticipated or would have wanted this kind of development. The Conservative Party itself has travelled a very long way from to a wee bit to the right of centre, I suppose, maybe a bit to the right of centre, to quite some way, facilitated by, in particular, the Johnson regime. But, and that has created a new kind of normal for the Conservatives, which is way to the right of where they've really ever been. To my knowledge, and certainly since the Second World War, I don't remember the Conservative Party being this far right. It's really, again, I'm sorry to say, very, very worrying. And the pronouncements from Keir Starmer don't fill me with satisfaction either. I mean, I don't think that the Labour Party, which comes in, will come in, will either have the authority or the will to turn much of this back. They'd be afraid to do that.
I suppose it's interesting you pick upon the way in which the Scottish Conservatives might well be less toxic, shall we say, than those down in Westminster. And yet the Labour Party in Westminster might actually have the opposite problem, and they are more toxic than those elsewhere. And it leads to this sort of mire of racism, which is pandering to a particular electorate, and rather than seeking to challenge and educate and indeed bring back into the fold, either it be traditional Labour Party values or Conservative Party values that at some point were held true. Cameron's an example, there are many others. Michael Heseltine comes to mind, many of the 1980s who perhaps weren't Thatcher's greatest admirers. But there seems to be a polarisation down in Westminster, which is not quite travelled up the M1, but is always in danger of doing so.
I think there's an element of mythology in all this as well. I mean, the electorate that the right wing of the Tory party, and increasingly now the Labour Party, that electorate, that racist electorate they're chasing, I think the opinion polls show that the electorate as a whole, if the opinion polls can be trusted, is actually a bit more tolerant and progressive than either of those parties. And they may be, I suppose it won't matter because only one of the two can win, but they may both have misjudged actually just how popular these views are.
Indeed, and looking in the UK to latest figures around inflation and indeed the cost of living, which continues to be crisis management for many people at home, as the latest food price inflation has been announced today is still over 17%, remaining above that over the past month, keeping the pressure on already strained household finances, and I'm quite sure most of us will be very well aware of that. Sales of the very cheapest value own label lines jumped an incredible 46% in the 4 weeks to the 16th of April compared with a year earlier, dropping into nearly 1 in 5 baskets as consumers sought to make savings. The rate of supermarket inflation dipped slightly to 17.3% from 17.5% a month earlier, according to data from Kantar. But the industry analysts said it was too early to say grocery inflation had peaked. Fraser McKevitt, the head of retail and consumer insight at Kantar, said, "We've been here before when the rate fell at the end of 2022, only for it to rise again over the first quarter of this year. We think grocery inflation will come down soon, but that's because we'll start to measure it against the high rate seen last year. It's important to remember, of course, that falling grocery inflation doesn't mean lower prices. It just means prices aren't increasing as quickly." Responding to the latest food price inflation, the SNP said that Brexit stubbornness is preventing the UK government from working closely with the European Union to tackle rising food price inflation, and they warned that there could be worse yet to come, with Brexit import checks set to begin in October. Experts have warned of a strong prospect of delays at the border and a new fee of £43 for all goods that are eligible for border checks, including things like chilled meat, dairy products and vegetables, could drive up inflation even further at the cost for ordinary people. The SNP's Europe and EU accession spokesperson, Alan Smith, accused the Tories of putting Brexit ideology before struggling households, and in a letter to the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Theresa Coffey, urged the UK government to put aside quarrels with the European Union to tackle those rising costs. Commenting, Alan Smith MP said in 2016 the Leave campaign promised lower food prices with Brexit. Now, more than 3 years later, the reality is that ordinary people are having to contend with record levels of inflation, sending the cost of basic staples up by as much as 80%. And any prospect of the UK government of UK government action is non-existent, with lingering Tory Brexit stubbornness preventing them from working with the European Union to bring down costs and support struggling households. A situation that will only get worse when dreaded import checks begin in October. John, no matter where you turn, the news in terms of finance and being able to afford to heat your home or feed your family just seem to get increasingly worse.
Yeah, these are disturbing figures. And again, if you were to present this sort of scenario to describe the world we're in now, present that, say, again to David Cameron, 10, 12 years ago, I think he'd be shocked at that kind of thing developing. Most conservatives, I think, would have been shocked by that. They've like a frog boiling and slowly in water. They've kind of got used to it all, and it's becoming again the new normal. These are terrible figures, and they represent, they're just statistics, but underneath those statistics, they represent real harm. Brexit is intentional self harm. The UK has, at least 48% of the UK has intentionally dropped us into this pit of despair. And most of the population now wishes to get out of it, but no leading politician has the nerve to embrace that popularity. You would think Keir Starmer would have the sense to look at the situation and say, make that move and say we'll get back in. And Scotland's situation is now that the UK has pulled itself out of the EU and jumped into this world of chaos and hardship, then it's like being manacled to a maniac.
Indeed. And why do you think it is that of all the leaders within the United Kingdom, there are so few who believe that actually returning to the European Union is exactly what they should be doing? What are they frightened of?
They're frightened of losing. They don't have confidence. I think it tells you something about politicians, not all politicians, but a significant number of politicians. For them, what really counts is their personal survival. And if they think that something might be a bit risky and something else might be a bit safer, they'll stick with the safe. It's there's virtually no. I mean, even the Lib Dems, long-term opponents of Brexit, the Lib Dems don't have the guts, and and their chances of becoming the government are quite low. So you would think they would have the courage to stick with their principles, but even they haven't. It's a deeply disturbing situation. I think we'll end up in the EU again, but it seems like we have to go through this, or at least the UK has to go through this, and we have to. There's more suffering to come. There's more anxiety, I think, to be developed here until there comes a tipping point, and who knows when that happens. Psychologists talk about it retrospectively, but no one knows when a tipping point is coming. But it will come. There will come a point when some party, maybe a new Labour Party, the Labour Party has a long tradition of being Eurosceptic. Maybe Scotland's independence and Scotland's return to the EU might push England in that direction. But who knows? Who knows?
Indeed. And in terms of misery and poverty, the Bank of England has a very stark message today. But the Bank of England a Bank of England economist has said that people in the United Kingdom need to accept they're poorer. UK households and businesses need to accept they're poorer and stop seeking pay increases and pushing prices higher. The Bank of England's chief economist, Hugh Pill, has said. Pill said a game of pass the parcel is taking place in the economy as households and companies try to pass on their higher costs. Speaking on a podcast produced by Columbia Law School, Pill said it's natural for a household to seek higher wages in response to soaring energy bills, or for a restaurant to increase its prices. However, he said the United Kingdom is a big importer of natural gas, and its price has gone up a lot compared with the services which the United Kingdom sells to the rest of the world. If the cost of what you're buying has gone up compared to what you're selling, you're going to be worse off, he said. So somehow in the UK, someone needs to accept that they're worse off and stop trying to maintain their real spending power by bidding up prices where their higher wages are passing the energy costs through on to customers. And what we're facing now, he continued, is that reluctance to accept that, yes, we're all worse off and we all have to take our share. His comments came in a day in which Nestle, PepsiCo and McDonald's have all reported that higher prices boosted their sales this year, and his families face 17.3% grocery inflation in supermarkets. I hate to make the pun that's obvious, but this seems like a bitter pill to swallow. Here's a man who's clearly making enough money that it's not really going to make much of a difference to him, telling us all just to put up and shut up.
This is something we've seen throughout history. When things get tough, capitalism for the poor, and a form of socialism for the rich or for the corporations, compensation of various kinds because they're struggling, and then when suddenly they're in a position making huge amounts, and the rest of us are suffering, that's okay. We'll just have to come to terms with that. That's capitalism. The hypocrisy is stunning.
Indeed, and that hypocrisy is something that has manifest itself almost now in terms of, I mean, one rule for one and rule for the other, we know as a kind of cliche, but increasingly what we see is, even in politics, that one rule for what's happening in Scotland and another rule for down in terms of rule breaking in Westminster. And that just seems to often be an acceptance that people have, that there are different rules for different people, which is in itself a great worry.
Well, we see that very much, don't we, with the treatment of the SNP at the moment. I mean, the astonishing, over-the-top, theatrical behaviour by Police Scotland. I don't know why on earth they're doing this. I mean, there are far more cars than at Fred West's house at any point. I mean, it's just utterly astonishing. You know, as a £3 billion aircraft carrier is scrapped before even getting into service, all we hear is about a few ferries that have been delayed. I mean, it's just the double standards are just astonishing, but all too predictable, because that's what happens when some people are in a position of power. They're able to bend reality to suit their interests.
Indeed, and bending reality to suit their interests is one place where we move back onto some kind of transport news, as P&O Ferries believe the prospect of a fine over their mass sackings is, quote, less than remote, unquote. And this comes from P&O Ferry executives who believe that there is a less than remote possibility of any fine from the investigation into its mass sackings of 786 workers last year, despite admitting it broke the law. In its annual report, the Dubai-owned ferry operator said that firing its entire UK-based crew without due consultation, as required under the law, UK employment law, was a solution to gaining essential operational flexibility. Although the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson and other ministers told the Commons that P&O would be fined and prosecuted for its actions in March 2022, P&O's directors are confident they will escape punishment from the Insolvency Service's continuing civil investigation. The government agency dropped a criminal prosecution last year, and according to P&O's filings, would need to show that any action it proposed to take was in the public interest and just and equitable. The directors consider, it continued in its report, that it will not be able to demonstrate this, and consequentially, there is a less than remote possibility of a related economic outflow in relation to any such action. There is no provision in the company accounts for any potential financial penalty. The report said the immediate dismissals of long-serving staff who were replaced by cheap agency crews from abroad were necessary for the long-term financial health of the business, and public sentiment will gradually recover towards the business as it continues to operate in a transparent and compliant manner. Maritime unions said P&O must be punished. The RMT General Secretary, a well-known figure on television screens on recent past, Mick Lynch, has said, and I quote, allowing corporate lawbreakers like P&O Ferries and DP World off scot-free is a profoundly dangerous trend for all workers in the UK and anywhere DP World's subsidiaries operate. John, surely this is a ferry that should be in the front page of every newspaper, a headline screaming at somebody sticking two fingers up, if I can be old-fashioned, to the laws of the land and the workers who found themselves out of a job.
Well, this is an interesting contrast, isn't it, with Scotland's ferry fiasco? It's just such a sharp contrast. the reason the market will recover, if I can put it that way, and that ordinary people will start using P&O ferries. That's if they ever stopped. I don't know if they ever stopped. Will start using P&O ferries again. Is because of the media coverage. There isn't the blanket media coverage of the abuses that P&O have carried out, as comparable to the kind of media coverage we've had of ferry breakdowns in Scotland every second day of the week for more than 2 years now. I think media representation here is hugely important in the extent to which you can expect a corporation to ever be punished. Corporations only ever get punished, I think, if the media serve the public interest and pursue them and expose them on a repeated basis, so that people remember this and maybe refuse to travel on a P&O ferry.
And I suppose that therefore moves the responsibility, in a sense, from the courts into the sort of public arena, where if legally they were actually doing, I hate to say doing their job, but in essence, I suppose in a sense that's what we mean, or what I mean, that it would mean that the media would have something to report rather than it being shuffled away somewhere, almost like some transgression by a Murdoch employee that nobody wants to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle to think of anything fresh to say about this. The extent to which the P&O story has just disappeared, and the extent to which the ferries have, and it's the same with the aircraft carriers. The aircraft carriers and the P&O ferries, for some reason, media power brokers, editors who know what side their bread's buttered on, have decided these are not stories that we need to hear much. They don't suppress them entirely. I mean, nobody could accuse them of behaving like Pravda and just completely wiping something out. I mean, they do allow the story to come out, but they don't revisit it and they don't explore it. They don't put resources into it. But when something, as we see in Scotland, when something can be used as a stick to poke the SNP with, then suddenly it's a story that's worthy of repeating every day of the week. It doesn't matter what it is. They can find a new breed of rat on a ferry, and that would be a story again.
I suppose it's the equivalent of the old front page headline with an apology in page 27, that it's buried somewhere that you don't get to see it. And increasingly, as we're seeing with what's happening in courts over the royal family and the Sun and the News of the World, and what happened over in America regarding Fox News, that it's a slow burn to get these particular malfeasant individuals in through a courtroom door. So there is perhaps for the media an argument that people get bored of it very quickly. But when it comes to an agenda that they have, they push it to the point where there's no boredom at all.
Yes, but a lot to do with the ambitions of journalists, of course. If journalists think that behaving in a certain way will please those above them in the system and lead to their promotion and their security, then that becomes normal for them, becomes instinctive and habitual that that's what you do. But if other stories, investigative reporting, as it used to be called, and as it used to be in a form more common, that puts your career at risk. 1 or 2 investigative reporters are tolerated, but if too many reporters in either working for an organisation that belongs to a corporation or an organisation that belongs to the state, then it's not likely to be good for your career to get right into that kind of thing.
Indeed, any success, you might end up being the head of Number 10's media unit. Moving on, we have UK government anti-strike laws, yet again more worrying news, because they have been criticised by the international community. The anti-strike laws that the UK government are putting in place have been condemned by the international community, who have described the measures as draconian. A joint letter signed by 121 politicians from 18 different countries, including Germany, France and Ireland, has condemned the legislation, which could see workers sacked if they go on strike. The letter also condemned the UK government for comparing the legislation to similar measures in other European countries, saying it rejects the UK government's attempt to justify it with comparisons to international norms. Earlier this month, First Minister Humza Yousaf told the STUC Congress that the Scottish Government would not impose the legislation in Scotland. Commenting, SNP MP Chris Stevens said, "This is a damning verdict on the Tories and their abhorrent anti-strike legislation, which punishes workers for going on strike and taking action over poor working conditions and pay." Ever since Brexit, the UK's standing in the world continues to decline, and this is another nail in the coffin of the UK's power and influence on the international stage. The UK government has been completely humiliated by their allies. This also blows a massive hole in the Tories' argument that this awful piece of legislation merely aligns the UK with other nations such as France and Germany. These countries have now come out and completely rubbished that claim, calling the restrictions, draconian. He continued, "I was pleased to hear the First Minister last week condemn this legislation and that it would not be enforced by the Scottish Government." Oftentimes I hear about the Labour Party and their proud record in terms of workers' rights, and it's absolutely right that we look at the way in which trade union legislation has been built in the United Kingdom over many decades, centuries almost, and yet what we have here is a blow that even Margaret Thatcher didn't feel she had the right to do, to the basic right of trade unions to take strike action.
Yes, this once more reveals how far we've travelled in this just over a decade of Conservative rule, and the gap between what I think David Cameron might have expected would happen and what has happened. I mean, some people have suggested we're on a path towards fascism here, and I mean, I wouldn't dream of suggesting we're that close to fascism, but the path is long and a gradual slope downwards, and we're on it. We're on that slope. I'm not suggesting for a minute we're close to fascism, but we're on that downward slope with the increased removal of workers' rights, of human rights, and the impoverishment of much of the population. It's deeply disturbing, and I think the Labour Party again does not look like it's going to champion our interests.
Indeed, it wasn't Brecht, the quote, but I think he used it in one of his plays where he talked of, I didn't complain when they came to take the trade unionists because I wasn't a trade unionist. And it goes on until eventually there was nobody left. And it's hard to see where some politicians are going to be able to claim that that was the point that they stood up and said enough was enough.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I, as I said already, I'm not suggesting we're that far along the road. There's a long way to go. But what happens in other countries, or what has happened historically in other countries that do become fully fascist, is that the step from the previous situation to full fascism wasn't quite that big. That already the kind of vaguely democratic governments that preceded fascism in Germany, Italy, Spain, and so on were already beginning to behave in fascistic ways. And so it's not something that it doesn't require a shocking change. It's like again, like the frog boiling slowly in the water. It creeps up on you, and things that you think would never happen do happen because they don't seem that far along the line, and because of course media coverage is entirely supine.
Indeed, and shock was something that we became used to under President Trump's regime in America. And news today that jury selection, I hear he's also planning to visit Scotland in the next week or so. But jury selection is to begin in Donald Trump's civil rape trial. This comes on the same day that US President Joe Biden has announced his intention to stand for a second term in 2024. And a federal court in New York has begun selecting a jury today to hear evidence that Donald Trump raped the famed advice columnist E. Jean Carroll nearly 3 decades ago. Carroll alleges that Trump pinned her against the wall of a New York department store and sexually assaulted her in late 1995 or early the following year as they shopped together. She brought the case last year under a New York state law opening a 1-year window for adult victims of sexual assault to file civil cases after the statute of limitations has expired. The case is, at least so far, the only one to come to court among more than a dozen allegations of rape, groping, and other sexual assaults against the former president, as well as accusations that he walked unannounced into women's dressing rooms at beauty pageants. Trump is not expected to attend the trial after his lawyer said he will not testify. Although Carroll's lawyers could ask the judge to put Trump on the stand as a hostile witness, they have said they do not intend to do so. Trump's legal team proposes to ask potential jurors whether they think the #MeToo movement has gone too far and about their views of the sexual assault allegations made against Brett Kavanaugh during the Senate hearing into his appointment to the Supreme Court. Carroll's lawyers are seeking to identify potential jurors who follow Trump on his social media network, Truth Social. They also want to ask if any of them believe Trump's claim that the 2020 election was stolen from him. Legal experts say that the judge, Lewis Kaplan, is likely to limit overtly political questions. Kaplan has ordered that members of the jury not be identified in public because of the significant risk they could be subject to outside pressure and targeted for retaliation and harassment from persons unhappy with any verdict that might be returned. It's a serious one, but it is a soap opera, Donald Trump and his time in the spotlight, which seems to never end. This, along with everything else that happened, you would think under normal circumstances would stop any political ambitions that anybody would have. But he just seems to be immune to reality.
Yes, well, I mean, I don't know if he's immune to reality, but I think he feels that the reality and its constituent kind of constraints. That's an unfortunate phrase. Don't apply to him. He doesn't. I don't think he thinks for a minute that he hasn't misbehaved, but I think he just doesn't think it matters when he misbehaves. So it's something he would just kind of brush off his shoulder. I'm quite, there's a lot to be concerned about in the history of the US over the last few hundred years. I mean, appalling foreign policy decisions, appalling consequences in terms of human life from some of the foreign policy initiatives that the US has done. The country itself, horribly unequal, massive problems with racism and with poverty. But unlike the UK, the elites are fragmented. And I think there is always space here for a degree of freedom, for democracy of some kind to operate in a way that some of the European countries are much more vulnerable. I think the US doesn't look like it's heading towards fascism, really, to my mind. It's heading towards tremendous inequality and impoverishment for some people, but there are people who will take any leader down in the US. And in the US they kill their presidents sometimes, and they look as if they might actually jail this one. I don't think it's impossible that he goes to jail.
And in terms of his supporters, obviously one of the things that Trump was able to do with the media was say, don't listen to them, they lie. Listen to me, I tell the truth. So that there seems to be a constituency of people who will believe anything he says and anything he does, and therefore seem to be immune to that sort of normality, that pressure that you would normally have of people saying, well, do your research and tell us what you actually think, rather than following people like sheeple, as they would accuse others of being.
Yeah. I mean, it's a cult, and there are millions of people in the US who will follow that cult, blindly. But as I indicated already, there are lots of other groups, and I mean, well, Biden is someone whose politics I wouldn't have been entirely content with in previous years. I mean, he's hawkish in terms of foreign policy, and he's backed by the corporations pretty much. He's not exactly a friend of the people, but I think he is committed to some kind of democracy there. And so the US has kind of pulled itself out. If we're on a slope down towards fascism, far from it, I admit, then the US took a wee step towards it, with the raid on the Capitol and so on, but they've pulled themselves out, showing the kind of, I don't know, rough and sturdy kind of resilient form of democracy they have there. Deeply flawed, but not likely to go down to totalitarianism, I don't think.
And from flaws in the United States to an oops moment as Italian tourism has a video being mocked for using footage of Slovenia. Italy's tourism ministry has faced ridicule after an official video to attract tourists to Italy used footage of people in Slovenia drinking Slovenian wine. The video, which is part of a €9 million, 9.91 million US dollars campaign, has been widely mocked by critics on social media, even before it emerged that part of it had been shot abroad. Titled Open to Meraviglia, Open to Wonder, the video features a computerized influencer version of Venus, a symbol of art, as depicted by Sandro Botticelli in the Renaissance masterpiece, The Birth of Venus. The very modern Venus dons a mini skirt and is shown eating pizza and presenting some of Italy's main tourist attractions, such as the Colosseum in Rome or Florence's cathedral. The art historian Tommaso Montanari called the advertising campaign grotesque and an obscene waste of money, while the video was lampooned by users of Italian social media platforms. The most controversial footage shows a group of young people smiling on a sunlit patio, drinking wine in what is presented as a typical Italian scene. However, eagle-eyed viewers spotted that the patio in question is actually in the Kotar region of Slovenia, close to the Italian border, and the bottle on the table has a Kotar wine label. It is unclear if the video for the Italian tourism campaign run by the Armando Testa communications group had any influence on Labour leader Keir Starmer when he made his St George's Day English Places video, which included scenes from Glasgow. The state of our education, eh? Did Mr Starmer go to his geography lessons, do you think?
Well, the minute I saw this story on the agenda, immediately, of course, I thought of Keir Starmer. It's not the first time. It's not the first time that some significant person south of the border has revealed their lack of awareness of the fact that there is a border or that there's anything different. It's not surprising. It's entertaining. It's entertaining, but it's not the first. Won't be the last. And some of the topics, of course, we've been on earlier, kind of push it into the insignificant area where we can have a wee laugh at it. Light relief at the end of the show.
Indeed, light relief. And also today, the Scottish Household Survey for 2021 had the results published. Scotland's chief statistician released the results of that survey, the Household Survey in Scotland of 2021. And in it, 96% of people rated their neighbourhood as a good place to live. Around two-thirds, 64% of households, were managing well financially, both the same as in 2020. Internet access was higher in 2021, 96% of households, than in 2020, 3% lower. As was internet use, 95% of adults in 21 compared to 92% 2020. Significant increase in internet use amongst older people. Levels of trust in the health, education and justice systems and in the police, the Scottish Government and local government were lower in 2021 than in 2020. Climate change was more likely to be viewed as an immediate and urgent problem in 2021, 83% of adults in comparison to 80% the year before. And this includes increases amongst people aged 75 and over. In the 12 months before they were surveyed, 59% of 2021 survey respondents had attended a cultural event or a place of culture, including the cinema, which was up from 44% in 2020. 84% had participated in a cultural activity, including reading, which was similar to the year before. 27% given unpaid voluntary help to organisations or groups, which was similar, just a percentage up from 2020. Satisfaction with Scottish Government funded early learning and childcare at 95% continued that trend and was similar to the year before. And responding to the survey, Deputy First Minister Robertson said, "These statistics show that the majority of people surveyed were satisfied with their housing and local services, including healthcare, and saw their neighbourhood as a good place to live." They also provide an insight into how people lived during the last phase of the pandemic and their interaction with public services as we entered the recovery period. The Scottish Government is focused on the three critical missions we have set out around equality, opportunity and community to improve the lives of people across the country over the next 3 years by tackling the issues which matter most, protecting people as far as possible from the harm inflicted by the UK Government policies and the ongoing cost of living crisis. And I suppose in a sense, John, this is going back to what you were saying earlier about how there is a presumption that there are certain elements within our community are going to vote a particular way and therefore they need to be pandered to. But in actual fact, when people are surveyed, there seems to be a slightly different way of looking at things, particularly when it comes to the climate.
Well, yes, I mean, that wasn't one of the ones I picked out, I must admit, the climate change. Clearly, people are becoming more anxious about that, and just justifiably so. These statistics, I'm a bit of a statistics hand here. I like a good scatter graph or whatever. A nerd, I think, is the word that's sometimes used. As you pointed out there, they paint a different picture from the dominant media narrative. The dominant media narrative, not surprisingly, I suppose, because that's what sells, is negativity, tremendous negativity. Now, that figure of 96% content with the communities they live in, feeling happy there. I've looked at that in the past, and I haven't come today with the comparative statistics, but I've got a feeling that's kind of unique to Scotland. Maybe not unique to Scotland, but it's different in some other parts of the UK, where people are less content with their neighbourhoods, where there is less affordable housing, where there are higher crime rates. You know, if people are content with the neighbourhood they live in, and they think it's a good place to live in, might one of the factors in that be the fact that there is half the level of crime in these areas compared to UK averages, and that violent crime has gone down incredibly low in Scotland. I mean, Scotland was, justifiably the murder capital of Europe only 20 years ago and more, but suddenly, things have improved dramatically. And those statistics tell us something. They tell us something objective, factual, and they weigh heavily against the misrepresentation of reality, the construction of reality to make people anxious, which is the major media effect that operates at the moment. People are afraid of crime, even though crime is falling, and that's because of media coverage.
Indeed, you're not going to see much of that in a tabloid headline. You're going to see quite the opposite, which is concerning in one way.
Yeah, very much.
And finally tonight, we have reports that the tender for air links to remote and island communities has been announced. And the next contract to operate the Scottish Government-supported air services from Glasgow to Barra, Tiree and Campbelltown will include a series of improvements. The invitation to tender for the contract, which will run for 4 years from the 25th of October 2023, has been published. It includes several new measures to improve these vital services, and they will include a residence fare for the air services to and from Barra and Tiree, which will also be available to residents on call. A larger community bank of rotations for the Barra service to help capacity at busy times of the year. The extension of medical seat reservations to the Tiree service following a successful introduction on the Barra flights. The Minister for Transport, Kevin Stewart, said these flights provide our remote and island communities with vital connectivity, making it quick and easy to go to medical appointments, travel for work, or see friends and family. I'm pleased to announce, he continued, the Scottish Government will support them for another 4 years, as well as bringing in new measures to improve the services for the people that depend on them. The new contract will be awarded later this year. And remote living within Scotland, we were talking about ferries earlier on, is difficult and tough. And these services become very, very vital to communities being able to exist where they have been for generations.
They do, and I mean, you have to weigh the cost of these against the benefits, and I think sometimes some island communities have maybe unrealistic expectations, but you can see them feeding that to the media for concerns about the access they have to the mainland. But there has to be an overall balance of this, and I think certainly the way the media cover these stories is wholly negative, and to a large extent ignores the fact that a major contribution has been made from the public purse to subsidising these services. Major subsidies go into the ferries, and there's no news coverage of that, no interest in that. Just interested when one of them breaks down. On air travel into the islands, I was a regular visit to Shetland for a while, delivering courses for teachers. And I'm just very impressed that people actually want to travel by air to some of the islands in winter. I can remember one flight into Sombra where people were screaming. Not myself, I claim, but one or two people were screaming because of the bucking and shifting of the plane in high winds.
I won't see you on any adverts for Loganair at any point in the future, no doubt. Well, thank you very much, John, for your time tonight. And as always, a tremendous contribution to the discussion that we've had along all of the topics that we've had. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And as I go to work out what kind of scattered graph tonight might well be involving all of the topics that we've looked at, or indeed find where that aircraft carrier may have gone, one wonders if perhaps there is a Tory peer out there who would know where the ship has sailed. But that is it for this evening. And before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, on behalf of everybody here, a very heartfelt thank you very much. We have always decided that our programmes will be free to view. However, if you can afford just £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. As some of the topics we've discussed this evening, in terms of the media being challenged and having an alternative to those headlines that you see that are perhaps a little more negative than they need to be, then in order to make that happen, we need to combine together to do that. So we are here, hoping and willing and wishing to be able to provide that kind of service. And setting ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers will enable us not just to employ new staff, but to achieve that kind of target, to make more that will be of a different hue and cry, and making more programmes that you might want to tune into. So on behalf of everybody here, and John, who joined me tonight, good night, and thank you for watching.